mark our pattern on the fur, we are going to do this on the back side of the fur, but it's important to look at the front and think about fur direction when you're marking things. The fur runs one direction. It's like a fabric with a nap. I want the direction of the fur to follow this arrow on my pattern. And so because that arrow is pointing that way, that is the direction that the fur is going. And when I mark it, I just mark using a regular pen. Just draw it on there. You might be tempted to use scissors to cut your fur, and some people have given some directions on how to do that successfully. I have not personally followed those directions successfully. So the idea with scissors is you're gonna just try to cut the leather part of the fur, and so you're not like sticking your scissors in and hacking a bunch off. And this is why, right? Like I'm pulling clumps of fur that I've just cut. You want to gently cut from, just try to cut the leather. So I'm just like inserting and cutting little snips, trying to make sure that I don't cut the fur. And I was sort of successful, but I still have some fur coming off where I don't when I cut with an X-Acto knife. So we're going to cut the fur from behind with a nice sharp X-Acto knife. I make sure that I have a fresh blade on here anytime I work on a fur project. And I like to keep a little tension on the fur when I'm cutting. And I just put a little pressure on it from the back until I feel it start to give. And then I follow my cutting line in a nice smooth motion. I'm going to show you guys how to join two pieces of fur together now. And the first thing that I do is just make sure that the fur is going the same direction so that it looks like one larger piece when I'm done. If I sew it with one of the pieces flipped, they no longer match up as well, and it's not going to look like one larger piece when I'm finished. Now that I know that my fur is going in the same direction, I want to work with it with fur side to fur side. It's a lot like putting right side of fabric with right side of fabric. And I put it together using these handy little clips, which you can purchase on Amazon or at Joint Fabrics or really like any local like quilting or sewing store. And I just go ahead and clip it in a couple of places to hold it together. I try to make sure that my fur is all going to the inside and not sticking out. But I tend to do a lot of that tucking of fur as I sew. I don't usually knot my thread to start out. What I do is I pick a spot and I take the needle through. And then I leave myself a little bit of a tail. And I stitch through that same spot just a couple of times. To secure it. I've stitched through twice now and it shouldn't go anywhere. Usually I leave my tail just a little shorter than this, but I wanted to leave it long enough to show you. Now that our thread is secure, we are just going to go ahead and whip stitch down the length of the seam. Usually with that tail of thread, what I like to do is whip stitch over it so that I know it's nice and secure. And it also gets that thread out of the way so that you're not dealing with loose threads. Sorry, this is a little awkward. Normally what I like to do is sew away from myself, but if I do that, the camera is not going to be facing the project at all, so you won't be able to see what I'm doing. So this is just a little awkward here, but yeah, tight little whip stitches to secure everything and get it sewn together. Your seam allowance should be pretty small. You do not want to go very wide with that because you want this to lay pretty flat when it's done. Now that it's all sewn together, I open it up and kind of press that seam flat. So to start, I am just going to stitch through the fabric only. And again, I'm going to leave a little tail. And then I'm going to take just a couple stitches through that same spot of just the fabric only to secure my thread. Now it's not going anywhere. And now in that same spot, I want to just barely poke the needle through both the thread and the leather until I can just barely feel it pricking my fingertip that's behind it. And then I want to come back up and I will have taken my first stitch. And then I'm going to go up and I want to do the same thing. And then I want to go up and do the same thing again. And now that I've reached the top, I'm going to start working my way over. So I go over just a little. Same thing where I just barely go through the leather. And now I'm going to start working my way down. And just barely work my needle through the leather. And you get these little V's, and that's just loosely securing your backing to your fur. Some seams are going to take a little bit more stress than others. A shoulder seam, for example, is going to have the weight of the garment hanging from it. Sometimes you might need to inset a gore, and so you've got a bit of a stress point there. And so with those, I like to herringbone stitch down some twill tape along that edge that I'm going to sew to the other edge. And I'm going to do that on both edges, just like you see with this gore. The only twill tape I have on hand right now is actually 1 inch wide, so I have gone ahead and cut it in half to make it 1/2 inch wide. And the nice woven edge, that nice strong edge, I have on that edge with the fur that I'm going to be sewing to another piece. And then the raw edge I just have angled, you know, toward the inside of my piece. And so to do this, what we're going to do is just through the twill tape alone, we're going to go ahead and take a small stitch. And I want to leave a little thread tail. And then through that same spot, I'm going to stitch just a few more times to secure my thread so that it doesn't pull out. And now through that same spot, we're also going to go through the leather. As we stitch it through the leather, we just want to make sure that point of the needle just barely passes through and pricks our finger that's on the back side there. And then pull it through. As we move over, we are also going to move down. What that's going to do is create that sort of like X pattern. So we're going to move down and away from the stitch, but we're going to have our needle point angled toward the first stitch. So I've moved down and over. And again, I just barely go through the leather. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go up and over away from our first couple of stitches, but our needle point is still going to be angled toward those stitches.
And now
We're going to go down again. We just want to alternate that. So again, we're going down and over with our needle point angled toward the stitches, and we're just barely going through the leather. And then I'm going to go up again.
So up,
over, away from the stitches, but our needle point is angled toward the stitches.
And we're going to go down. And we're just going to repeat
this alternating pattern of up and down
until we have finished
our little row of herringbone stitch.
Now that our two pieces
for that seam have their twill tape herringbone stitched down, I am just going to take them and put them together, clip them together in a few places, and then just whip stitch them just like the other seam that we did
already.
So once again, I'm just doing my start with a little tail and stitching through the same spot a couple of times. And this time, when I stitch through to do my whip stitch, I'm making sure that I catch both the twill tape and the leather.
And just doing that little whip
stitch.
And we just do that for the length
of the seam, those tight little whip stitches through both the twill tape and the leather. You're going to find yourself needing to insert a gore into just a slit in the fabric. I actually find this easier to do with fur in some ways than with fabric. It's easier to me because you don't have a seam allowance that you're dealing with and trying to fold over. Instead, what you're going to do is take the edge of your gore and the edge that you've cut here, and you're just going to insert the tip of that gore all the way up until the cut stops, and then clip it all together and whip stitch it in. So I like to clip one side and start at the bottom and whip stitch all the way to the top. And then I like to remove all the clips, flip it around, and whip stitch from the top to the bottom of the other side. I have my gore most of the way whip stitched in up the first side. So I'm going to go ahead and finish it here with you guys. As I'm stitching, just like with the reinforced edges last time, I'm making sure that I go through both the twill tape and the fur for each piece. And I'm keeping my seam allowance very, very narrow because again, we want this to lay as flat as possible when we are done sewing it.
And I'm getting up
into this corner here where I'm going to have to turn it in just a minute. I just want to sew as far as I can up this edge.
Now I've reached the
point of that gore. So I'm going to go ahead and flip it.
And I'm gonna
prep it for sewing just by knocking some of that loose hair back to the inside, because we don't want that getting in the way of our sewing and getting caught. So now that I've flipped it, I'm going to start going back down that side.
once again just
Making sure that I catch the twill tape and the leather for each piece as I sew.
and you can stop
and clip this if it makes you feel more comfortable.
I'm about to run out of
thread here, so I'm just going to go ahead and take it through the same spot a couple of times, and then I usually like to just put my needle through that loop and pull it tight, and then I'll snip it off. I haven't quite finished sewing it, but so now that we have our finished Franken piece of fur, we're going to finish the outside edges. This is the edge that's going to attach to your fabric. So once again, I've got my twill tape. Again, it is my 1/2 inch wide because I cut it myself, twill tape, so it's got a raw edge. You're going to take that nice finished woven edge, and again, that is what's going to go on the edge with your fur. So this time we are working twill tape to fur side. So again, it's like right side of fabric to right side of fabric when you are sewing. This gets kind of complicated when the direction of the fur is, as you can see, the fur is running top to bottom, and you still have to finish that edge. And so you're going to be fighting all of this fur. It's easier on some of those edges where the fur wants to go down to keep the fur out of the way. So I'm going to show you on the most difficult part because might as well get that out of the way, right? So what I like to do in this case is just take my twill tape, and instead of trying to line it up like, you know, going straight on, I like to start at the top and just put it up against that cut edge and then slide it down until I've got edge to edge. And that way I'm not really fighting the fur as much. And you are more than welcome to clip this again if it's easier for you. But what I like to do to keep the tension is just work little sections at a time, and I just keep it clipped with my finger.
So I'm in the process
of whip stitching down that piece of twill tape to fur side of this piece of fur. And I am approaching a corner. Corners can be a little tricky, both on this step and the next step. And so I thought I would show you how I usually tackle them once I get there. Almost there. So as we're whip stitching this down, once again, it is a pretty narrow seam allowance, and you just want tight little whip stitches to hold everything down. All right, so on a corner, I am sewing this twill tape pretty much to the edge of the corner.
So
you can see I'm getting pretty close there, or at least I hope you can see. And what I like to do is insert my needle when I get to that edge where I finally want to turn it. I insert my needle, but I don't draw it all the way through. And what I like to do is just take the twill tape and I start turning the corner. And I keep it nice and taut and keep that fur out of the way. And once I've got it turned like that, I go ahead and pull my needle through. And then I just take it around the corner and I insert it pretty close to that spot, but not in the same spot where I had it before. And I just keep whip stitching away.
So what that looks like,
once I've turned the corner,
and I'm just going to finish
up a few more stitches and then I'll come back and show you the next step.
So our twill tape
is now attached. It is twill tape to first side. And what we're going to do on this step is actually take that twill tape and fold it over that sewn edge, just fully encasing it. And I like to do this in small pieces. I clip a little bit and then sew and clip a little bit and sew. And the stitch that we're using is, once again, whip stitch. And as we're doing this whip stitch, we're working on that raw edge and just stitching that down to the leather. So this is where your stitches can get a little bit bigger. They don't have to be quite as tight and small. And you basically just take a little bit of the leather and also grab the twill tape and pull. I've reached the corner, and so once I hit the corner, I go ahead and start folding this bottom edge, and I would probably clip in a couple places so that it's not moving on me. And I take this corner where I've folded it and I'll whip stitch this down, twill tape to twill tape.
and just tack it down. And once it's tacked down,
I go back to sewing on the cut edge of the twill tape, just tacking it down to that leather.
And we'll go around
And do this on the whole piece so that we can move on to the next step.
So one other
method for attaching your fashion fabric to your lining, which is all finished, has its twill tape edges. Your fashion fabric, once again, is hemmed somehow. I have already taken a little knot just through the fold of the fashion fabric, and I've lined up my edges. The fashion fabric is just barely hanging over the edge of the twill tape, and what I'm going to do is take a stitch through the fashion fabric, and I'm going to catch the twill tape, and I'm going to run my needle under the twill tape and then come back up through all of the layers, so out of the fashion fabric, and I'm going to take a very small stitch, catching just one thread, so very small stitch, go back all the way through under the twill tape, run it under the twill tape and come up a ways through all the layers.
And I'm going to do that
again where I just take a small stitch, just literally one thread, and I'm going to go back down under the twill tape, run it under the twill tape, and then come back up through all of the layers. And we're going to do that again, one tiny little stitch, and run it under the twill tape, and then come back up through all of the layers. We're just going to repeat that a few times. And I'm going to call it finished.